Alright, so how do you know that your brake pads need to be changed or your brakes need overhaul? Um, a lot of guys will sort of freak out a little bit if their brakes are real squeaky, and they'll spend a bunch of money on aftermarket rotors and brake pads and stuff like that. Um, it's never really bothered me. My front brakes do squeak from time to time. Some bikes, they naturally squeak and they always squeak. You can try, different brake pads, different brands of brake pads. If you want to put a new rotor in there or whatever, I feel like it's kind of a waste of money, but that's up to you guys. There are also shims you can use under the brake pads. There are different lubricants and silicone and this and that that are supposed to quiet down your brake pads. Um, that's up to you. You can, do whatever you want with that, but squeaking brake pads are not an indication of worn brake pads. Um, to assess your brake pads, what I usually do, I'm not sure if the camera's going to pick it up, but I'll actually peer down into the crevice right down in here and see if I can just see how far worn down my brake pads are. Usually you can see the pad and it's fairly distinguishable, and you can notice, oh, okay, there's still some good meat there. And if not, if it looks like it's wearing down, then it might be time for a replacement. Another thing which you should do, especially when you're getting your bike for the first time, is come up to all your rotors like this and feel them. They should be smooth, or at the very most just a little bit ribbed. These are just about perfectly smooth, and that's because no one in this motorcycle's history has ever wore down the brake pads so much that it was metal rubbing on metal. What that will cause is sort of the backing of the brake pads will rub against the rotor here when you apply the brake, and it will scratch these grooves in the rotor. And that's kind of dangerous for a number of different reasons. First off, it's going to just eat away any new brake pads that you have. And second, it reduces your stopping power. Alright, so we're going to think about it like this, right? You have your brake rotor, and it's this circle. And then you have, your brake caliper, which comes down here on either side, and they sort of squish together on the rotor to stop the bike. Well, if you look at it from head on, right, here's your rotor, and if the rotor is scoured from worn brake pads or brake components digging into the metal, what you're going to get is this warped surface like this, and there can be grooves in it. It could be really sharp, it could be dull, or whatever. I don't really think that it matters too much, in my opinion, whether or not they're sharp or dull, because when you have a straight brake pad that is applied to it, you can see all this air in here, all this reduced space. That's all lost braking power. And you can compare that to one that's flat, and you have, sorry, my pen's running out, all this surface area right here to stop the bike, whereas here you've got far less. And so if you've got a brake rotor that has all these grooves worn in it, it's definitely time to think about replacing it. That's what they're going to look like, all those grooves. Yeah, definitely time to replace it. Even if you have good brake pads, and even if they're not tearing into your brake pads, just run your hand along it, and if they are warped like this, it's time to replace it. Alright, now to orient you guys to some of the components of a brake system, everything starts when you pull the brake lever. That is going to actuate this little piston in your master cylinder here. This is all full of fluid, and the piston shoves some fluid down your line, down the line, Usually right behind here, if you've got dual brakes up front, then there's a splitter that splits the one line into two, and you see they come out. Set you guys down. Alright. Now, the line comes down here, and it's going to go into your caliper and your slave cylinder here. You get it? Master tells the slave what to do. And then you've got this caliper here, which sort of goes on both sides of your rotor. This is your rotor. Goes on both sides of your rotor and squishes it together, and you've got brake pads on both sides of your rotor. And so typically you've got one or two pistons that push one of the brake pads against the rotor, but this moves from side to side. See, we've got these little rubber baffle-y things here. This moves from side to side, so when you push one side against it, the other side will push against too, and they should push against uniformly. If you take your brakes off and you find that one brake pad is more wore down than the other, then you know that this needs to be cleaned up. I'm sorry. These are these sort of cylinders that this thing slides up against, and I'll show you guys when I take this thing off. I'll show you guys what that is. But yeah, and it squishes together, and it should release and sort of pop back. It's not going to be noticeably a pop back, but it should just pop back when you release the brake lever. Alright, so before we start taking the caliper off to assess the brakes, it's a really good idea to have sort of a length of wire. I use the cut-out coat hanger or a string on hand, and I'll demonstrate why in a minute, but just make sure you have one of these on hand. Now we're going to go after these bolts. They look like maybe 14s or something. Take them both out. Alright, once you have them out, your caliper really should just slide right out like this. And now's the time that you want to take this wire, because you don't want to leave this thing hanging from its brake line, because that'll stress the brake line. So what I like to do is just sort of take this wire and hook it around the cap of my radiator. You can hook it anywhere, you know, just so long as it keeps this thing dangling and in suspension. Now, on this bike, as you can see, caliper came right off here, and it left the brake pads in the bracket here. Some bikes have the brake pads are going to be in here. Some bikes they're going to be in here. Doesn't really matter which one you have. Basically, you just sort of want to slide them out like this, and then you take a look at them. This is a little metal backing. This is where the piston of the caliper pushes in, and this is a little metal backing to protect the pad. But sometimes you're going to have clips that hold these things in. They're sort of like mustache-shaped clips, and just be careful to know which way that they go, because sometimes it can be difficult to remember which way they go. So yeah, this one was super easy, no clips really, but I'm going to take them both out. I'm going to take a look. See how they're both pretty much wearing pretty evenly, and there's still a lot of meat left on these. These are very, these aren't near being worn down. So if these weren't wearing evenly, what I would do is I would look to these things. See how these move in and out pretty freely? If they're stuck, then that might be why your brake pads are not wearing evenly. These both should move pretty evenly, and so you can grab them with, you know, pair of pliers or whatever, you know, and wiggle them back and forth, get some grease in there, and make sure they're wearing evenly. So now what we're going to do is, you know, we take our new pads and put them right back. They go back the way they came, obviously. Alright. Now sometimes guys will run into a problem, because now you can't get your caliper back on, because the new pads are so much thicker than the old ones, obviously, because there's more brake pad there. And so you go to put this thing back on, and it won't go on. Well, what do? You have to depress the piston. This is the piston, and it goes up and down like here. Not such a good idea to hyperextend the piston when it doesn't have brake pads in them. Like right now, I wouldn't go jamming on my brake lever. But if you've got really worn pads, you might find that your piston is up to like this level here, because the piston will travel out slowly and just sort of stay out the more that your pads wear down. So it might be out here. So what you gotta do, take your grips here and basically just grab it and squeeze it down. Sometimes it might be a little bit difficult to do that, and you have to release the bleeder valve here. But anytime you release the bleeder valve or take off a brake line, remember you're going to have to rebleed your brakes. Most times you aren't going to have to rebleed your brakes when you do your brake pads. So if I find that I'm trying to squeeze this and I'm not getting it, what I'll do is I'll open the cap to the master cylinder up top and see if I can push some fluid all the way back up the line. Sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes there's nothing you can do, but you got to open up your bleeder valve and release some of this fluid, and then it will usually just fall right down. Well, not fall right down, but it will be able to be squeezed right down. If you can't squeeze it down, if it just won't go, it might be time for a brake rebuild or to replace the calipers. Because a lot of times what you'll find is this little rubber boot here, it'll get all wore out and cracked and fall off, and then you're going to get rust down in here, and it's going to prevent good brake travel. So that's definitely something to assess while you're in here. But anyway, so let's say you have this thing all depressed down like mine is. We got our new brake pads in. We're just going to take it off the wire. Slide it right back in, throw my bolts in, and we're good to go. Sometimes brakes are a little bit squeaky when they first get installed, new brakes. Try and live with it. If you absolutely can't live with it, then you can experiment, like I said in the beginning of this video, with different products. But that's up to you. I never really gave a shit. So, that's that. If you guys got any questions, let me hear it.